Good evening, and welcome back. Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to be a very small boy, lying awake in a great painted room at the edge of a desert, watching the light of a single oil lamp move slowly across a wall covered in gods and birds and rivers of gold, and knowing, without quite understanding it, that one day all of this would somehow belong to you? That is where tonight's journey begins, not with a battle or a curse or a great golden mask, but with a child, half asleep in a palace beside a slow brown river, while the lamplight climbs the wall and the painted figures seem to breathe. Because the whole vast story of Tutankhamun, the golden boy king of Egypt, the child who was crowned before he was 10, who slept beneath the desert sand for more than 3,000 years, and whose calm gold face became the most famous image the ancient world ever left behind, really does begin with something that gentle. A boy, and a lamp, and a wall full of quiet gods. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you are listening from somewhere special tonight, drop your location and your local time in the comments below. I always enjoy reading where everyone is settling in, from the quiet of one room to the quiet of another, all of us drifting off under the same old stars. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together, down the long green ribbon of the Nile, into the golden century of a boy who would be remembered longer than almost anyone who ever lived. Long before there was a boy, and long before there was a golden mask, there was the river. Everything in Egypt begins with the river, and so this story does too. The Nile came out of the far south, out of lands that the Egyptians themselves barely knew, and it flowed north, steady and patient, across a country that would otherwise have been nothing but sand. On either side of the water lay the desert, red and empty and endless, but along the banks of the river there was a narrow band of black earth, rich and soft and dark, and it was in that thin green ribbon that a whole civilization grew and lived and dreamed. The Egyptians had a name for the black soil and a name for the red sand, and they knew exactly where the one ended and the other began. Their whole world was the gift of the water. Each year the river did a remarkable thing. In the heat of summer, far away in the mountains where the Egyptians could not see, great rains fell, and the water gathered and swelled and came sliding down the length of the country in a slow brown flood. The river rose over its banks and spread across the fields, and for a few weeks the land on either side became a shining sheet of water dotted with the tops of trees and the roofs of villages. And then, just as patiently, the water drew back, and it left behind a fresh layer of that dark, fertile mud ready for planting. The people watched the river as other people watched the sky. They measured how high it rose. They prayed that it would rise neither too little nor too much. And around this yearly gift of black earth, they built their farms, their villages, their temples, and in time their kings. Picture the country in the ordinary way that it worked, long before our boy was born. Along the water, farmers rose with the light and went down to the fields. They planted barley and wheat and flax. They raised cattle and geese and goats. They fished in the shallows with nets and with long spears, and they poled slender boats made of bundled reeds through the marshes where the papyrus grew taller than a man. They baked bread in simple ovens, and they brewed a thick, sweet beer, and bread and beer together were the food of nearly everyone, from the poorest labourer to the servants in the palace. They built their houses out of mud brick, shaped in wooden moulds and dried hard in the sun, and that same warm brown mud that fed them also sheltered them. Life moved slowly, season by season, following the rhythm of the water. There was flood, and there was planting, and there was harvest, and then there was flood again, and in that unhurried circle the years of Egypt turned, one gently into the next, for thousands of years. Above the farmers stood the great houses of the country, the temples and their palaces, and above everything stood the king. The Egyptians did not think of their king as merely a powerful man. To them he was something closer to a bridge between the world of people and the world of these gods, the one figure whose duty it was to keep everything in balance, to make the river rise, to keep the sun crossing the sky, to hold back the endless empty chaos of the desert, and keep the ordered green world alive. They called that balance by a word we usually translate as truth, or order, or rightness, and they imagined it as a calm goddess with a single feather. The whole task of a king, from the greatest to the smallest, was to hold that feather steady, to keep the world in its proper place. It was a heavy thing to lay on the shoulders of any man. In our story, it would be laid upon the shoulders of a child. By the time the boy was born, Egypt was already unimaginably old. The great pyramids that we still picture when we think of Egypt were, even then, ancient monuments raised more than 10 long centuries before him. Already worn and weathered and half wrapped in legend, kingdoms had risen and fallen. Times of unity had given way to times of trouble, and then order had returned, again and again, like the river itself. And in the age our young prince came into the world into, an age we now call the New Kingdom, Egypt stood at one of the great high points of its long life. It was rich. It was powerful. Its armies had marched far to the north and far to the south, and gold and cedar and ivory and strange treasures flowed back along the trade roads into the storehouses of the temples. It was, above all, a golden age in the most literal way, because gold came down the river from the deserts and the southern lands in such quantity that foreign kings wrote letters begging for it, saying that in the land of Egypt gold was as common as dust. At the centre of all this splendour lay the city of Thebes, far up the river in the south. Thebes was the great religious heart of the New Kingdom, and its temples were among the wonders of the ancient world. On the east bank of the river, where the sun rose, stood the vast temple complex we now call Karnak, a forest of enormous stone columns painted in bright colours, hung with banners, its gateways towering over the crowds, its courtyards filled with statues and offering tables and the smoke of incense. This was the home of the grandest of the gods of that age, a god named Amun, whose name meant something like the Hidden One, and who had risen over the centuries to become the king of the gods, the divine father of the pharaohs themselves. His priests were powerful and wealthy. His temples owned vast lands and great herds and countless servants. And each year, in a series of glittering festivals, the statue of the god was carried out of the deep shadows of his shrine and paraded before the people in a golden boat. And the whole city came alive with music and singing and the scent of flowers and myrrh. On the west shore of the river, where the sun set, lay the land of the dead. Here, in the dry cliffs and desert valleys across the water from the living city, the Egyptians of this age buried their kings and queens and nobles. They had long since given up building pyramids, those great signposts that had only invited robbers, and instead they had begun to cut their royal tombs deep into the rock of a hidden desert valley, a lonely sun-baked place ringed by pale cliffs, watched over by a single peak shaped almost like a natural pyramid. We call it now the Valley of the Kings. There, in secret, in tomb after tomb, tunnelled far back into the mountain, the pharaohs were laid to rest with everything they might need for eternity, and the tomb makers who did the work lived together in their own quiet village nearby, generation after generation, fathers teaching sons the craft of carving and painting a doorway into the next world. Hold that valley in your mind, that quiet place across the river from the noise of the living. Our whole story will end there, in the darkness and the gold. The kings of the New Kingdom were, for the most part, great and famous rulers, warriors and builders whose names filled the temple walls. And in the years just before the child was born, the throne came at last to a man who would do something no pharaoh had ever quite done before, something so strange and so bold that it turned the whole country upside down and shaped, more than anything else, the world that the young ruler would be born into. To understand the child, we must first understand his father, and the astonishing thing his father tried to do. So we turn now to the reign of the Sun King, the Pharaoh who tried to change the gods of Egypt, and we will tell it softly, as one tells a strange dream in the morning, when the sharp edges have already begun to fade. The man began his reign under a name that honoured the hidden god of Thebes, and in his early years he ruled much as the kings before him had ruled, among the temples and the priests in the ordinary way of things. But this king had an idea, and the idea grew in him until it filled his whole reign. He came to believe that beneath and behind all the many gods of Egypt, all the hawks and cats and rams and hidden ones, there was in truth only one power that mattered, and that power was the sun. Not the sun as a person with a human face, but the shining disk itself, the great light in the sky that touched every living thing each morning, that warmed the fields and lifted the crops, and gave life to bird and beast and man alike. He called this power the Aten, the disk of the sun, and he came to love it above everything, and to believe that he alone truly understood it, and that his family alone stood between the sun and the people as its living channel. At first this was only a matter of emphasis, a new devotion, a fresh temple here and there. But the king's belief deepened, and it hardened, and in time it became something no pharaoh had ever demanded. He changed his own name so that it no longer honoured the old hidden god, but honoured the sun disk instead. He turned aside from the ancient temples. He turned away most of all from the mighty god of Thebes and from the powerful priests who served him, and one by one he closed the old shrines, cut off their offerings, and even, in places, ordered the old names chipped from the walls. And then he did the boldest thing of all. He left Thebes altogether. He led his court far down the river to a stretch of empty desert where no city had ever stood, a place unclaimed by any old god, and there, on fresh ground, he built an entirely new capital from nothing, a bright, clean city of sun temples open to the sky. And he named it for the sun disk he loved. To that new city he brought his great queen, a woman famous even now for her beauty. And there, in the glow of the desert sun, they raised their daughters. And there, in that strange, bright city of the sun, our boy was very likely born. It is important to say, gently, that this was a hard and unsettling time for many ordinary Egyptians, even though we tell it here as calmly as a story before sleep. The old gods had comforted people for 10 long centuries and more. Families had prayed to them in sickness, had carried their little images in times of trouble, had trusted them to weigh the heart kindly after death. And now the king had swept much of that away and offered in its place a single distant disk in the sky, one that ordinary people could reach only through him. The great temples fell quiet. The festivals dimmed. The priests lost their place. Something in the settled rhythm of the country had been disturbed, and though the sun still rose faithfully over the new city, and the artists of the court painted the royal family bathed in its long gentle rays with little hands at the ends of each beam, many people, we think, simply waited, quietly, for the old order to return. It always had before. The river had taught them patience. Into this strange, shining, unsettled world the boy was born. We do not know the day, and we cannot see his mother's face clearly across the gap of so many years, though it seems he was a son of that very royal house, born close to the throne, a small prince among princesses in the Sun City. He was given a name, as a child, that honoured the sun disk his father loved, and as a very small boy he would have understood nothing else but that bright new capital, its wide sunlit courts, its open temples where offerings were laid out under the open sky, its painted palace walls, its gardens and pools. He would have been raised after the manner of royal children, tended by nurses, watched over by tutors, dressed lightly against the desert heat. His head shaved, but for a single long lock of hair worn at the side, the mark of a child in Egypt. He would have learned to walk in rooms painted with birds and fish and flowering reeds, and he would have fallen asleep, very likely, in exactly the manner we imagined at the beginning, watching the lamplight climb a painted wall while the desert cooled and the great house grew still. But the bright experiment of his father was already fragile, and it did not long survive. The Sun King grew old and died, as all kings do, and the throne passed uneasily, through shadowy figures whose stories we can barely trace, until at last it came to rest, astonishingly, upon the head of a small boy. He was perhaps 8 or 9 years old. He could not yet have understood the weight of what he was taking up, the balance of the whole world laid across his narrow shoulders. Around him stood grown men, advisers and officials and soldiers, who had lived through the strange years, and who now quietly saw their chance to set the country right again. And so the reign of the young ruler began, not with the child's own will, for he had almost none yet, but with the careful, patient hands of older men, guiding a little pharaoh gently back toward the old and comforting ways. The first great change of his reign was a change of name, and it tells the whole story in a single quiet gesture. The boy had been born with a name that honoured the sun disk of his father. Now, still only a child, he was given a new one, a name that turned away from the lonely sun and back toward the old hidden god of Thebes, the king of the gods whose temples had stood empty for so long. From that day the boy was called Tutankhamun, and the meaning of the new name was itself a kind of promise. A promise that the living image of the old god had returned, that the world was to be set right again, that the doors of the great temples would be opened, and the offerings laid out, and the festival sung once more along the river. The child, of course, did not choose the name, any more than he had chosen the crown. But he would carry it out of the dust of history and into the memory of the whole world, and it is the name by which we know him still. And so the little court gathered itself and turned homeward. The strange bright new capital in the desert, built so hopefully on its fresh desert ground, was slowly abandoned, its great families packing up and drifting back to the old centres of power. The child king and those who guided him returned to the ancient cities, to Memphis in the north near the wide green fan of the delta, and to Thebes in the south with its towering temples, and everywhere the message was the same, gentle and unmistakable. The old order had come home. The hidden god was honoured again. The feather of truth, which had tilted so alarmingly in the years of that Sun King, was being set carefully back into its place, and the hands that steadied it were the hands of grown men acting in the name of a boy who was still, in so many ways, only a child watching the lamplight on the wall. Two men stood closest to the boy Pharaoh in these early years, and it is well worth knowing them gently, because their steady hands shaped his reign far more than his own small ones could. The first was an older official, a man who had served at court for a very long time, wise in the workings of temples and titles and the slow machinery of the palace. A man who seems to have been almost a grandfather to the boy, guiding him through ceremonies he was far too young to understand. The second was a soldier, the commander of the armies, a strong and capable man who kept the borders quiet and the country safe while the child grew. Between them these two carried much of the true weight of ruling, and around them stood the scribes and the stewards and the priests, the whole patient body of people who actually kept Egypt running, counting the grain, measuring the flood, recording the taxes, and keeping the great slow wheel of the country turning, while a boy sat, small and solemn, upon the golden throne. The great work of the reign, the thing the young ruler is remembered for besides his tomb, was the quiet mending of what the years of the Sun King had broken. It was done not with anger, but with patience, as one might tidy a room that has been left in disorder, setting each thing back where it belonged. The temples that had fallen silent were opened again. The old images of the gods, some of them damaged, some of them simply neglected, were repaired and renewed, carved fresh from good hard stone, plated in gold and silver, and set back in their shrines. The priests were called back to their duties. The offerings, the bread and beer and geese and flowers and incense that the gods were believed to need each day, began once more to flow. The great festivals returned to the river, the golden boats, the crowds, the music, the scent of myrrh drifting over the water, and the people, who had waited so patiently, gathered again along the banks to watch their gods pass by. The child Pharaoh had this work recorded on a great slab of stone set up in the temple, in the careful formal language of royal proclamations. And though we will not read its words aloud tonight, the sense of it is easy to feel across the centuries. It confessed in its stately way that the land had fallen into trouble, that the temples had been neglected, that the gods had turned their faces away, and that the ordered world had slipped out of true. And then it declared that the young monarch had set everything right, had filled the temples with treasure once more, had doubled and tripled the offerings, had made the gods glad again, so that they would smile upon Egypt and let the good years return. Whether the boy himself dictated a word of it, we cannot know. But his name was on it, and in the eyes of his people that was what mattered. The living image of the old god had come home, and the world was well again. We should linger here, in these good quiet years of the boy king's reign, because they are the warm heart of our story, and because they show us the Egypt he actually lived in, the sights and sounds and smells of an ordinary golden day along the river. So let us leave the great affairs of state for a while, the temples and the proclamations, and simply walk, in our imaginations, through the living country in the years when a boy sat upon its throne. Begin at dawn, when the light comes up pale and pink over the eastern desert and the river lies flat and silver in the coolness of the morning. In the villages the smoke of the first fires rises straight into the still air, and the smell of baking bread drifts along the lanes. Women grind grain between two stones, patient and rhythmic, and shape the dough and set it to bake, and children carry water up from the river in tall jars balanced with practised ease. The cattle are led out to pasture along the green edge of the fields, and the geese are let loose, honking and flapping, and the farmers take up their wooden hoes and their simple ploughs and go down to the black earth to work while the day is still kind. Everything smells of mud and water and green growing things, of animals and smoke and warm bread, the ordinary comfortable smell of a country at peace with itself. As the sun climbs, the fields fill with quiet work. Men break the soil and scatter seed, and drive it in beneath the hooves of animals. In the season of harvest they cut the barley and the wheat with short curved blades, and the women follow behind gathering the stalks, and the grain is carried to the threshing floor, where oxen tread it round and round, and then it is tossed into the air so the wind carries away the chaff, and the good heavy grain falls back to the ground. Scribes stand along the edge of the fields with their reed pens and their sheets of papyrus, measuring, counting, recording, because in Egypt everything was written down, every basket of grain, every head of cattle, every jar of oil. It was a country that loved order and lists and careful accounts, and much of what we know of it we know because those patient scribes wrote it all down and left it for us to find. Down on the river itself the boats are moving, and the river was the great road of Egypt, its highway and its main street all in one. Slender fishing boats slip through the reeds, and broad cargo barges drift downstream with the current, heavy with grain or stone or cattle, and lean upstream against the wind with their single square sails spread wide to catch the north breeze that blows, conveniently, against the flow of the water. Fishermen spread their nets and haul them dripping and heavy with silver fish. Fowlers crouch in the marshes among the tall papyrus, throwing curved sticks at the clouds of ducks that rise from the water. Boys swim in the shallows, and cattle wade in to drink, and everywhere the river gives and gives, food and travel and water and life, exactly as it always had, exactly as it always would. In the towns the craftsmen bend over their work in the shade of open workshops, and it is here, among the makers of beautiful things, that we come closest to the world that would one day fill the young king's tomb. There were potters shaping bowls and jars on simple wheels. There were weavers working fine white linen on their looms, cloth so fine it could be nearly transparent, prized above almost anything. There were carpenters joining wood into chairs and beds and boxes and chariots, working with woods brought from far away, dark ebony from the south and fragrant cedar from the north. There were jewellers stringing beads of carnelian and turquoise and deep blue lapis, that precious stone the colour of the night sky flecked with gold, carried the whole long distance from distant mountains far to the east. And above all, for our story, there were the workers of gold. Gold was the metal of the old gods and of the king, and the Egyptians loved it not only for its worth, but for its meaning. It did not tarnish, it did not rust or dull or fade. It kept its warm shine forever. And so it seemed to the Egyptians to be a piece of eternity itself, the very flesh of the gods, the substance of things that would never die. The goldsmiths beat it into sheets so thin they were almost weightless, and laid that gold leaf over carved and shaped wood, so that a wooden shrine or a wooden statue or a great wooden coffin could be made to shine as though it were solid gold. They cast it, and hammered it, and drew it into fine wire, and inlaid it with coloured stones and glass, and set it into collars and rings and bracelets and crowns. To watch a master goldsmith at work, patiently pressing a whisper-thin skin of gold over a carved wooden face until the face itself seemed to catch fire in the light, was to watch a small piece of eternity being made by hand. Remember these craftsmen. Their patient work, done in the ordinary daylight of the young Pharaoh's reign, would sleep in the dark for 33 centuries and then astonish the entire world. And over all of this daily life, gentle and unhurried, lay the deep comfort of the gods, who to the Egyptians were not distant or frightening, but woven into every hour of the day. There was a god of the sun who sailed across the sky each day in his boat, and passed each night through the dark underworld to be born again at dawn. There was the great god of the dead, calm and green-skinned, who had himself died and risen, and who ruled the peaceful land beyond the grave. There was his devoted wife, the great mother goddess, who had gathered him up and made him live again, and their falcon-headed son, and a jackal-headed god, who watched over the dead and tended the delicate work of preparing the body for eternity. There were household gods, small and friendly, a cheerful dwarf god who guarded sleeping families and frightened away bad dreams, and a kindly hippopotamus goddess who watched over mothers and their babies. Ordinary people wore little images of these friendly gods on cords around their necks, and kept them in niches in their mud-brick walls, and felt themselves surrounded, day and night, waking and sleeping, by a great warm company of the divine. This then was the Egypt of the child ruler, and it is easy, across so many centuries, to feel its deep and settled peace. A green river valley cradled between two deserts, a country fed each year by the patient gift of the flood. Villages of warm brown brick, fields of gold and green, boats upon the water, the smell of bread and myrrh, the endless careful work of scribes and farmers and craftsmen, and over it all the bright unhurried company of the gods. Into this world the boy had been born, and in this world he grew slowly, from a small solemn child into a young man, wearing the crown that older hands had set upon his head, learning, year by year, to hold the great feather of the world a little more steadily in his own two hands. Let us follow that boy now into the palace itself, into the private rooms where a young pharaoh actually lived, because although he wore the crown of a god, he was still in his own person a growing child, and the things left behind with him tell us so with a tenderness that reaches right across the ages. He grew up surrounded by objects made small for small hands, and then, as the years passed, by objects made for a young man. He had games to play, and one among them was a board game that Egyptians loved, a game of squares and moving pieces that stood for a soul's journey through the dangers of the next world to a happy end, and boards for this game were laid away with him so that he might go on playing through eternity. He had chairs and stools and beds, some of them plain and sturdy, some of them gilded and carved with lions and gods. He had chests full of folded linen, and boxes of jewellery, and jars of scented oils and eye paint, and fans of ostrich feathers to stir the heavy air, and lamps to push back the dark. He had clothing of the finest woven linen, and he had sandals, many pairs of them, some plain for every day and some worked with gold, and a few made so that the images of Egypt's enemies were painted upon the soles, so that with every step the boy Pharaoh symbolically trod his foes beneath his feet. He had gloves for driving, and he had walking sticks and staves, a whole forest of them, more than 100. Some worn smooth as though from real use, and this has made many people wonder, gently, whether the young ruler leaned on them, because his own body was not always strong. For all his gold and all his power, there are signs that he was not a robust young man, that he may have walked with some difficulty, that illness may have shadowed him. But we will not dwell there. In the daylight of his reign he was, above all, a king, and he did the things a king was expected to do. He rode out in a chariot, that swift and glorious invention of the age, a light frame of wood and leather drawn by a pair of horses. And the child Pharaoh had many chariots, some for war and ceremony, and some, it seems, for the pure joy of speed. He hunted, as pharaohs were expected to hunt, driving his chariot across the desert edge after ostriches and wild game, or gliding through the marshes after birds and after the great beasts of the river. His artists showed him doing these things again and again, drawing his bow from a speeding chariot, striking down the enemies of Egypt, hunting lions in the desert, and although much of this was the grand and formal image every pharaoh wore, there is real energy in it. The picture of a young man doing young and vigorous things under the wide bright sky. And he was not alone. Early in his reign the young monarch was married, as royal children were, to a young woman of his own royal house, a girl who had herself been born in the strange bright desert capital, a daughter of that same Sun King, and therefore very close to him in blood, as royal marriages so often were in Egypt. Her name was Ankhesenamun, and she was, in all likelihood, both his wife and his half-sister, and the two of them, these two children of the vanished Sun City, grew up together at the head of the whole kingdom, a boy king and his young queen, learning to rule a country that was older than either of them could imagine. The artists of the court loved to show them together, and the images are among the gentlest things Egypt ever made. Here is the young queen offering flowers to the king. Here she stands before him, tying a collar of blossoms about his neck, or pouring perfume into his cupped hand, or walking beside him through a garden thick with birds. There is an ease between the two small figures, a leaning together, a tenderness that no rule of art required, and it is one of the quiet miracles of this story that across more than 30 centuries we can still feel the warmth between a boy and a girl who wore the double crown of a mighty kingdom while they were scarcely more than children. They had, it seems, great hopes of children of their own, as every royal couple must. But here the story touches sorrow, though we will pass over it softly, as the Egyptians themselves would have wished. Among the treasures later laid in the king's tomb were 2 tiny coffins, one within another, and within them the small still forms of 2 infant girls who had never drawn breath. 2 daughters born too soon, who did not live. We do not know their story, and we will not invent one. We only know that the young king and his queen, for all their gold, knew the oldest and gentlest of human griefs, and that when the time came to prepare the king for eternity, someone chose to lay those 2 small ones beside him, so that he should not travel into the long night entirely alone. It is a detail that turns the Golden King back, for a moment, into simply a young husband and father, and it is perhaps the most human thing in the whole shining hoard. So the years of the reign passed, quiet and golden and, we hope, in their own way happy. The temple stood open and busy again, the offerings flowed, the festivals came and went with the seasons of the river. The old adviser and the soldier commander kept the great machine of the country running, and the young pharaoh grew toward manhood, still guided, still learning, still perhaps leaning now and then upon one of his many staves. Egypt was at peace with itself, its gods restored, its balance mended, and had things gone on as they seemed likely to go on. The child king might have reigned for 50 years, might have built great temples and fathered many children, and left a long and famous name, and we might remember him today as one more of the great pharaohs whose deeds fill the temple walls. But that is not what happened. His reign, so bright and so promising, was also very short, for the boy pharaoh was not to grow old. He died young. That is nearly all we can say for certain, and it is enough. He had reigned for only about 10 years, and he was still, by our reckoning, hardly more than a boy grown into a very young man, perhaps 18 or 19 years old, when his brief life came to its end. How it happened we do not truly know, and the scholars who have studied his fragile remains have offered many gentle guesses. An illness, a weakness carried in the blood, a hurt that would not heal, some quiet failing of a body that may never have been strong. We will not choose among them tonight, and we will not linger over the how, because this is a story for rest, and because the Egyptians themselves would not have wished the moment dwelt upon. They did not speak of a king dying. They spoke of him going to his rest, of his flying up to join the sun, of his passing into the beautiful west, where the dead god ruled in peace. And so we will say it their way. The young ruler slipped quietly out of the daylight of his short reign and into the long sleep, and the great house grew still around him, and the lamps burned low, and Egypt drew a slow breath and began to prepare its child Pharaoh for eternity. For the people of the palace, his death must have come as a shock and a difficulty as well as a grief. For he had no living children to follow him, and the succession of the whole kingdom now hung in the balance. But that is a matter of state, and it belonged to the grown men who had always carried such things. For us tonight, what matters is what they did next, the slow and loving and astonishingly careful work of sending a king into the next world. Because it is that work, more than any battle or decree, that would carry the young monarch's name across the whole of time and lay it, at last, in front of our own wondering eyes. To understand what they did, we must first understand, softly, what the Egyptians believed about death, for they did not think of it as an ending at all. They thought of it as a doorway, a crossing from one kind of life into another, and they had spent thousands of years learning, as they believed, how to make that crossing safe. They thought that a person was made of several parts, not only a body but also a kind of life force, and a soul that could move and travel, and a name and a shadow, and that after death these parts were scattered and had to be gathered and made whole again, exactly as the great god of the dead had once been gathered and made whole by his devoted wife. If the body could be preserved, and the proper words spoken, and the proper things provided, then the soul could return to the body each night as a bird returns to its nest, and the dead one could live again in the beautiful West, in a green and endless country very like Egypt itself, only better, where the barley grew tall and the river never failed, and one lived forever in the light of the sun. But the crossing was not without its dangers, and this too they had mapped with patient care. The soul of the dead had to pass through a dark underworld, a long night country full of gates and guardians and hidden dangers, following the same path the sun itself took each night beneath the world. And at the end of that journey lay the great hall of judgment, where the heart of the dead one was weighed in a balance against the single feather of truth, that same feather the living king had laboured all his life to hold steady. If the heart was light, unburdened by cruelty and lies, it balanced the feather, and the dead one was declared true of voice and welcomed into the everlasting fields. If the heart was heavy with wrongdoing, a waiting creature devoured it, and that was the end. To help the dead pass safely through all of this, the Egyptians wrote out long books of spells and prayers and maps of the night country, and laid them in the tomb, so that the traveller would know the words to say at every gate. We call these writings the Book of the Dead, though the Egyptians called them by a gentler name, the Book of Coming Forth by Day, because their whole hope was that the dead would come forth again into the morning light. All of this comfort, all of this careful preparation for the long journey, was now to be gathered around the body of the boy king. The first and most delicate part of that preparation was the making of the body itself into something that would last forever, and this was a slow and sacred craft that the Egyptians had perfected over many centuries. It took, by their custom, about 70 days, and it was carried out by priests who were also skilled in the work, in a special tented place set apart for the purpose, near the river. We will speak of it gently, for although the details can sound strange to us, to the Egyptians it was an act of the deepest love and reverence, the careful remaking of a mortal body into the lasting home of a soul. The body was washed with water from the river, pure and cleansing, and then it was slowly and patiently dried. The Egyptians had discovered that a certain natural salt, gathered from the desert where old lake beds had dried away, would draw the moisture out of flesh and leave it preserved, and so the body was covered over and packed with this salt. and left for many long days while the water of life was gently drawn away, and the flesh grew dry and still and lasting. The inner organs, which decay most quickly, were carefully removed and preserved on their own, each set apart in its own vessel, watched over by its own protective god, and stored to travel with the king. And through all of this the priests spoke the proper words, prayer after prayer, naming each part of the body and blessing it, calling upon this god and that to guard the eyes, the mouth, the limbs, the heart, so that nothing should be lost and everything should be made ready for the journey. When at last the body was dry and preserved, the wrapping began, and this was perhaps the most beautiful part of all. Yard upon yard of fine white linen, some of it torn from the king's own clothing, some of it woven especially for the purpose, was wound around the body in layer after careful layer, and between the layers the priests laid small treasures, for each was believed to protect and to help. There were amulets of gold and of coloured stone, little images of gods, symbols of life and of endurance and of well-being, a small scarab beetle over the heart carved with words asking the heart not to speak against its owner in the hall of judgment. There were finger coverings and toe coverings of pure gold, and golden sandals for the feet, so that the king should walk into eternity shod in the metal of the gods. And as each layer was wound and each amulet set in place, more words were spoken, more prayers murmured, until the young king lay wrapped in white and gold, still and peaceful, ready to have his face restored to him. For the last and greatest act was to give the king back a face, a perfect and shining face that would never age or decay, a face by which the gods and his own soul would always know him. And so, over the wrapped head of the young pharaoh, the goldsmiths and the priests laid the mask, that famous golden mask that you have surely seen, even if you have never thought about the young man beneath it. But we will come to the mask in its own time, at the darkest and most solemn moment of our story, when it is laid over his face in the deep quiet of the tomb. For now, let us simply hold the picture of the 70 days drawing to their close, the child king made lasting and whole, wrapped in white and gold, blessed with 1,000 prayers, waiting in the still tented place by the river for the day of his burial. While the priests did their slow and sacred work upon the body, another kind of work went on all across Thebes, a great gathering and making of everything the king would need in the life to come. And here the true scale of an Egyptian royal burial becomes almost dizzying, for they did not send their king into eternity with a few treasured things. They sent him with an entire world. The storerooms of the palace and the workshops of the temples were emptied and filled and emptied again, and craftsmen laboured long to make what was still needed, and slowly a mountain of goods was assembled to travel with the boy into the dark. There were beds and chairs and stools and footstools, some plain, some gilded, some carved into the shapes of fierce protective animals. There were chests packed with clothing and with sandals and with jewellery. There were the board games for the long evenings of eternity, and the fans to stir the air, and the lamps to give light. There were weapons, bows and arrows and daggers and shields, and the chariots taken apart to fit through the narrow doorways of the tomb. There was food, real food, loaves of bread and cuts of meat, and jars of wine and honey and oil, and baskets of fruit and grain, that the king should never hunger. There were dozens of small servant figures, little carved and painted images meant to come to life in the next world and do the king's work for him, to plough and reap and carry, so that he himself might rest. And there were shrines and statues of the gods, and great chests to hold the preserved organs, and boats, model boats, for sailing the rivers of the world beyond. Everything a king might need, and everything a king might love, was gathered and made ready, and much of it was overlaid with that patient skin of gold, so that when it was all at last set in its place, the little tomb would blaze in the lamplight like a room full of frozen sunshine. At last the 70 days were complete, and the day of the burial came. Picture it now, in the soft way of a thing remembered rather than seen. In the cool of the morning the great procession gathered on the east edge of the river, at the rim of the living city, and then it crossed the water toward the country of the dead in the west. Boats carried the mourners and the priests and the long train of treasures over the smooth brown river, and on the far side the procession formed again, and began its slow walk up into the desert hills, toward the hidden valley where the kings lay sleeping. At the head went the priests in their leopard skins, chanting, burning incense, sprinkling milk upon the path. Behind them came the treasures, borne across the shoulders of servants, the gilded beds and chairs and chests, the statues, the chariots, the food, the flowers, glinting under the climbing sun. And then came the king himself, drawn upon a sledge, his golden coffin lying within a great gilded shrine, and behind him walked the mourners, and among them, we may believe, his young queen, and the old adviser, and the soldier, and all the great household of a king, walking slowly up into the silence of the hills. The tomb that had been made ready for him was small, smaller by far than the vast tombs of the greater kings around him, and this too has its gentle mystery, for it seems the boy Pharaoh died so unexpectedly that no grand tomb of his own stood finished, and so he was laid instead in a modest chamber cut into the floor of the valley, perhaps one first intended for someone else. But if the tomb was small, what was placed inside it was not, and the priests, with workers, must have laboured hard to fit an entire golden world into so few rooms. Down a steep passage and through the narrow doorways the treasures were carried, and set in place chamber by chamber, packed close, chair upon chest upon bed, the gilded animals staring out into the dark, the little servant figures ranked and waiting, the food and the wine and the flowers laid ready, until only the burial itself remained. In the deepest room they had built a nest of gold around the body, one shining shell within another. First a great stone chest, and within it a series of shrines of gilded wood, one inside the next like the leaves of a folding box, each covered in sacred images and words of protection. Within the innermost shrine lay a coffin, and within that coffin another, and within that a third, and this last and innermost coffin was made of gold, heavy solid gold, shaped in the likeness of the young ruler with his arms crossed upon his breast, holding the emblems of a ruler, his calm face gazing up into the dark. And within that golden coffin lay the wrapped body of the child Pharaoh, and over the face of that body, at the very middle of all those shells of gold, they laid the mask. Let us pause on it now, this most famous of all the treasures, this face that the whole world would one day know. It was made of 2 sheets of gold, beaten and joined and worked by a master's hand, and it showed the young monarch in the perfection of eternal youth, calm, serene, untroubled, his eyes wide and steady, made of white stone and dark glittering stone, so that they seem to look gently back at whoever looks upon them. He wore the striped royal headcloth, its bands inlaid with deep blue glass, and upon his brow rose the two guardians of a pharaoh, the cobra and the vulture, ready to defend him. About his shoulders lay a broad collar of gold and coloured stone, and the whole face was smooth and young and quiet, a boy made deathless, a boy made of sunlight, gazing up out of the darkness with the faint, calm half-smile of someone who has passed safely beyond all trouble and is only, now, at rest. Over the rapt face of a young man who had died too soon, his people laid this shining, ageless, peaceful face, that he might meet eternity, beautiful and unafraid. And then, their work complete, they closed him in. The lids were lowered, the shrines were shut, one within another. The mourners spoke their last farewells. The priests performed the final rites, the opening of the mouth, the ancient ceremony meant to give the dead one back the use of his senses in the world to come, so he might breathe and speak and eat again beyond the grave. The last offerings were laid out. The remains of the funeral feast were gathered up and buried nearby, and the dried flowers and the tools, and everything touched by the great occasion. And then the living climbed back up the passage into the daylight, and behind them the doorways were sealed, plastered over and stamped with the seals of the royal burial ground. The jackal god crouched above his captives, guarding the door. The rubble was filled in, the last footprints were smoothed away, and the boy king was left alone in the perfect dark, at the very centre of his golden world, to begin the longest sleep that any human being has ever slept. Now the story slows almost to stillness, and we come to the strangest and the most peaceful part of it all, the long quiet, the more than 3 millennia that the young king lay sleeping while the whole world above him rose and fell and rose again. Settle into this part. There is no danger in it, no sorrow, only the vast, slow turning of time, and the boy asleep at the still centre of it, safe and undisturbed beneath the sand. For a little while at first the tomb was in some danger. Twice, within a few years of the burial, robbers found their way in through the sealed doorways, slipping down the passage in the dark, snatching handfuls of small precious things, oils and jewellery and gold, before they were caught or frightened away. Each time the guardians of the valley found the damage, tidied what they could, repacked the disturbed rooms in some haste, and sealed the doorways once again. And then, having been sealed a second time, the little tomb of the young pharaoh was left in peace, and the peace, this time, would last for an almost unimaginable span. For the valley went on being used, king after king cut into its cliffs, and in time, when the workmen came to carve a tomb for a later pharaoh in the rock just above, they piled the broken stone and the rubble from their digging down across the slope, and it spread over the hidden doorway of the child ruler and buried it deep. They even built rough little huts of stone upon that rubble, shelters for the workmen, and lived and worked directly above the sleeping king without ever knowing he was there. And so, layer by layer, chip by chip, flood by flood, the desert drew its blanket over him, and the very memory of where he lay, and at last that he had ever lived, faded quietly out of the world. Above him the years became centuries, and the centuries piled up like the sand. The great age of Egypt that he had been born into, the new kingdom, went on for a time in glory. Mighty kings came after him, warrior builders whose names still ring, who raised temples so vast that we walk through them today in astonishment, who fathered scores of children and reigned for lifetimes, who fought great battles and signed the first treaties of peace that history records. The temples he had helped to reopen filled again with priests and offerings and song, and the river rose and fell, and the boats went up and down, and the people lived their gentle ordinary lives, and none of them remembered the small king sleeping under the rubble in the valley. But even the greatest of ages must turn, as the Egyptians themselves knew so well, for they had watched the river teach it every year. Slowly, over long generations, the strength of Egypt began to ebb. The far provinces slipped away, the wealth that had flowed in so freely began to fail. The central power weakened and split, and the country that had once reached out to the ends of the known world drew back in upon itself, tired and poorer and older. The priests of the great temples grew mighty as the kings grew weak, and in time, to protect the honoured dead from the robbers who now troubled even the royal valley, those priests gathered up the bodies of the greatest pharaohs, the very kings whose names had filled the world, and moved them quietly from their plundered tombs, hiding them away together in secret places in the cliffs. They gathered up nearly all of the old kings. But the boy pharaoh they never touched, for they, like everyone else, had forgotten that he was there, and so, alone among all the great pharaohs, he stayed exactly where his people had laid him, in his own tomb, in his own golden nest, undisturbed. The centuries flowed on. Egypt, grown weak, was ruled at times by strangers, by kings out of Libya and out of the lands to the south, by conquerors out of the great empires rising in the east. New peoples came down the ancient roads with new weapons and new gods, and Egypt, which had once conquered, was now conquered in its turn, again and again, and each time it endured, changed a little, and lived on, as the river lived on beneath whatever boats happened to be floating upon it. And still the young ruler slept, and the sand lay deep and warm above his face, and he knew nothing of any of it. Then out of the north, out of a land the old pharaohs had barely heard of, came a young conqueror from Greece, brilliant and unstoppable, who took Egypt almost without a blow and was welcomed as a deliverer, and who founded on the shore of the sea a new city that would become one of the wonders of the world, a city of marble and learning, with a great tower of light to guide the ships, and a great library to gather all the knowledge of mankind. After him his followers ruled Egypt for 300 years, Greek kings and queens who took the old titles of the pharaohs and worshipped, after their fashion, the old gods, but who spoke Greek in their palaces and looked always toward the sea and the wider world. The last of them was a famous queen, clever and charming, the final ruler of independent Egypt. And when she too passed from the world, Egypt fell at last under the power of a new empire greater than any before it, the Empire of Rome, and became a distant province, a granary to feed a faraway city, ruled by governors sent from across the sea. And still, through all of it, through Greek and Roman alike, the child Pharaoh slept on beneath the valley, and the dust of 13 centuries and more lay over him, and not one living soul knew his name. And then, slowly, the old world itself began to fade. The whole vast, comfortable world of the Egyptian gods that had stood for more than 3,300 years. New faiths spread across the land, faiths that worshipped one god and turned away from the old company of hawk and cat and hidden one. The temples fell silent for the last time. The offerings ceased. The festivals ended. The last priests who could still read the old sacred writing grew old and died, and no one came after them. And the beautiful picture signs that covered every temple wall became, for century upon century, nothing but mysterious decorations that no living person on earth could read. The knowledge of how to read them was simply lost, as though a door had closed. The great temples stood empty and slowly filled with sand. Whole cities were abandoned to the desert. And the meaning of Egypt, the living understanding of what all those signs and gods and tombs had been for, sank away beneath the centuries as completely as the young monarch had sunk beneath his rubble. The world forgot how to speak to its own oldest ancestor. For more than 1,000 years and more after that, Egypt lay wrapped in its long silence, a land of half-buried wonders whose builders no one could any longer understand. Travellers came and marvelled at the pyramids and the broken statues and the temples drowning in sand, and told strange stories about them, and went away again. And still, beneath the quiet valley in the south, deeper than any traveller's foot, the boy king slept on, his gold undimmed in the dark, his calm face gazing up at the underside of a lid, waiting, though he did not know he waited, through century after century after century, while the sand blew, and the stars wheeled overhead, and the whole world changed beyond all recognition. At last, only a little more than 200 years ago, the long silence began to break. Scholars and soldiers came from Europe, drawn by the wonders half buried in the sand, and they measured and drew and carried away, and among the things they carried away was a broken stone covered with the same writing in 3 different scripts. One of them the lost picture writing, and one of them a language that could still be read. And after years of patient labour, a brilliant young scholar, comparing the scripts sign by sign, at last cracked the ancient code, and the beautiful lost writing spoke again after more than 1,000 years of silence. Suddenly the temple walls were no longer mute. The names of the old kings could be read once more. The prayers and the records and the stories came flooding back into the light, and the world began at last to remember Egypt and to hunger to know it and to dig. Through all the long 19th century they dug, and the great museums of the world filled with statues and coffins and treasures. And the names of those pharaohs came back one by one out of the silence. Explorers cleared the temples of their sand and opened tomb after tomb in the royal valley. And as tomb after tomb was opened, a strange and disappointing pattern appeared, for nearly every one of them had been robbed in ancient times, emptied of its treasures, its royal owner long since carried away by those careful priests to the secret hiding places. It began to seem that the valley had given up all its secrets, that everything worth finding had been found, that no untouched royal tomb, no king still lying in his gold, remained anywhere beneath the sand. Learned men said as much, plainly. The valley, they declared, was finished. There was nothing left to find. And all the while, under a low mound of ancient rubble and the ruins of some forgotten workmen's huts, in a spot that diggers had passed over and even piled their own debris upon, the young king slept on in the dark, whole, golden and waiting, the last great secret of the valley, and the greatest, keeping himself for a morning that was very nearly come. The morning came in the shape of two very different men. One was an English lord, wealthy and kindly and often unwell, who had come to the warm, dry air of Egypt for his health, and had fallen, as so many did, under the spell of its buried past, and who was willing to pay, year after year, for the long and patient labour of digging. The other was an archaeologist, a careful, stubborn, gifted man who had spent his whole working life in Egypt, who had begun as a young artist copying the paintings on ancient walls, and had grown into one of the most exacting excavators of his age. Together these two, the patient patron and the patient digger, had won the right to search the royal valley, and together they had dug there. Season after season, through the long hot years, and found very little. Others had told them the valley was empty. The digger did not believe it. He was certain, with a quiet, unshakable certainty, that one king remained unaccounted for. One royal name that appeared here and there in the records, but whose tomb had never been found, and he believed that this king still lay somewhere beneath the untouched ground, and he meant to find him. That forgotten king was the boy who had slept for 3,000 long years. By the autumn of what we would call the year 1922, the search had gone on so long, and turned up so little, that the money and the patience were both nearly at an end. The Lord had all but decided to give up. The digger persuaded him to pay for one last season, one final chance, and promised that if this season too found nothing, he would trouble him no more. And so, that November, the workers set to clearing one last patch of ground that had not yet been touched, a place near the entrance of another king's tomb, where a cluster of ancient workmen's huts stood upon a bank of old rubble. They took down the huts. They began to dig away the rubble beneath. And on the very first morning of that last hopeless final season, almost at once, a boy carrying water is said to have scuffed his foot against something in the sand, and there, beneath the debris, cut into the living rock, was a step. They dug on, hardly daring to hope, and the single step became a stairway, cut down into the rock, and the stairway led down to a doorway, and the doorway was blocked and plastered and stamped, from top to bottom, with the ancient seals of the royal burial ground, the jackal god above his row of captives, untouched, unbroken, exactly as the priests had pressed them into the wet plaster more than 3,000 years before. The digger stood before that sealed and unbroken door, and understood that he was looking at something that almost no one in the whole history of the search for Egypt had ever seen, a royal doorway that the robbers and the priests, together with the centuries, had all somehow passed by. And then, with a discipline that is almost painful to imagine, he had the stairway filled back in, set a guard upon it, and sent a message across the sea to summon the Lord who had paid for it all, so that the two of them might open the door together. And then he waited for weeks beside the buried step, while the greatest discovery of his life lay sealed a few feet beneath him in the dark. The Lord came hurrying out from England with his daughter. The stairway was cleared again. The first sealed door was carefully taken down, and beyond it a passage packed with rubble was cleared away, foot by foot, until at last they stood before a second sealed doorway, stamped like the first. And now came the moment that has been told and retold ever since, the moment the whole long story had been sleeping toward. The digger made a small hole in the upper corner of the second door. He pushed a lighted candle through into the darkness beyond, and put his eye to the hole, and for a long moment he could say nothing at all, while the hot ancient air, escaping after 33 centuries, made the candle flame flutter, and shapes began to swim up out of the dark. Behind him the others waited, and the Lord, unable to bear the silence, finally asked whether he could see anything. And the answer he received has never been forgotten. The digger himself wrote down what happened, and his own words are the best that could ever be spoken, so let them be spoken here, in the quiet, exactly as he set them down. At first I could see nothing, he wrote, the hot air escaping from the chamber causing the candle flame to flicker, but presently, as my eyes grew accustomed to the light, details of the room within emerged slowly from the mist, strange animals, statues and gold, everywhere the glint of gold. And then, of the question and his stammered reply, he wrote, when Lord Carnarvon, unable to stand the suspense any longer, inquired anxiously, "Can you see anything?" It was all I could do to get out the words, "Yes, wonderful things." Wonderful things. 3 simple words, spoken in a stone passage in the desert, and with them the young Pharaoh's long sleep was, in a sense, over, and the golden world his people had packed around him in their grief came flooding up into the light of the living after more than 30 centuries in the dark. When at last they opened the doorway and stepped inside, holding up their lamps, they stood in a small room crowded to the ceiling with treasure, and the digger later tried to describe the strangeness of that first sight, the everyday and the marvellous heaped together. The sight of the objects, he wrote, was as one imagines it, and yet more wonderful than one could imagine. It was a sight beyond all dreaming, and the impression of it can hardly be described. There were 3 great gilded couches, shaped like fierce animals. There were caskets and chests and stools, chariots taken to pieces, bunches of flowers 3 millennia old, jars of oil and wine, and everywhere, laid across everything and heaped upon everything, the soft, warm, undying glint of gold. And standing guard on either side of yet another sealed doorway, 2 life-sized statues of the king himself faced each other across the little room, black and gold, staring calmly out as they had stared, in the perfect dark, for the whole long age of the world. It would take the digger and his helpers nearly 10 years of the most careful work to empty the tomb, for they meant, to their great honour, to record and photograph and preserve every single object exactly as it lay, to lose nothing and to learn everything. And so, slowly, patiently, the golden world was lifted back into the daylight, object by object. The beds and the chariots and the little servant figures, the games and the fans and the sandals, the folded linen and the withered flowers, and at the centre of it all, in the sealed inner chamber, the great nest of golden shrines and coffins opened at last one within another, down and down, until they came to the innermost coffin of solid gold, and lifted its lid, and found, beneath it, wound in his darkened linen, the boy himself, and over his quiet face the shining, ageless, peaceful mask of gold, gazing up at them out of 33 centuries with its faint, calm half-smile, exactly as his people had left it. News of the discovery ran out across the world like light, and it is worth pausing to feel how completely it caught the imagination of everyone, everywhere. This was a time when the world had grown weary and grey, just after a terrible war, and here, suddenly, out of the sand of Egypt came a story of pure wonder, a lost child king, a sealed door, a room heaped with gold, a face of eternal youth rising untouched out of the deep past. The newspapers filled their pages with it. Crowds gathered at the valley. Everything the boy Pharaoh had touched, everything his artists had made and his mourners had packed away, became famous overnight, and the shapes of his treasures, the mask above all, spread across the whole world onto posters and jewellery and fashions and songs, until the name of a small pharaoh who had reigned so briefly and died so young was, within a few short months, better known than the names of the mighty kings who had reigned for lifetimes all around him. And there lies the gentle wonder at the very centre of this story, the quiet joke that time has played. Of all the pharaohs of Egypt, the young ruler was one of the least. He reigned only a decade. He built no great temples of his own that still stand. He fought no famous wars. He died before he could do the deeds that make a king remembered. And after his death, those who came next did their best to leave his name off the lists entirely, so that within a few generations he was forgotten by his own people. By every measure the ancient world would have used, he was a minor king, a footnote, a boy who came and went. And yet, because he alone among all the pharaohs was overlooked by the robbers and forgotten by the priests, and buried by the sand and left, alone undisturbed in his gold, he became, in the end, the most famous of them all. The one whose face the whole world knows, the one-child king who outshone every conqueror. The greatest of the pharaohs were carried off, and hidden and unwrapped and studied. The least of them was left to sleep in his gold, and so it was the least who woke into the widest fame. There is something in that reversal that feels almost like a kindness, as though the long forgetting had only been the setting for a longer remembering. His treasures were carried, with enormous care, down the river and to the great museum in the capital, and there, in time, the golden mask was set up behind glass for the world to come and see, and come it did, in its millions, year after year, filing quietly past that calm gold face, drawn to it from every country on earth. And more than once his treasures travelled out into the wider world as well, crossing the seas to be shown in the great cities of distant lands. And wherever they went the crowds formed and waited for hours for the chance to stand, for just a moment, before the shining face of the boy who had slept so long. Many of you listening tonight may remember such a time, may remember when the Golden King came to a museum within reach, and the long patient lines and the hush that fell over people as they came at last into the room where the gold lay glowing under the lights. It is a rare thing to stand before a face that is 300 years old and to feel, across all that time, not fear and not sadness, but a kind of calm, and that calm is the child Pharaoh's last and greatest gift, the thing his people worked so hard, so lovingly, to give him, and which he now, so long after, quietly gives back to everyone who looks upon him. For what the tomb gave the world, in the end, was not really the gold, though the gold is beyond price. What it gave was the boy himself, restored to us as a person. Because his tomb survived whole, we know him as we know almost no other figure from so deep in the past, not through the boasts of monuments, but through the small and tender things of a life. We know the games he played and the chairs he sat in. We know that he owned a little chair sized for a child, kept perhaps for sentiment into his grown years. We know the clothes he wore and the perfumes he liked. We know that he loved, or was given, ostrich fans and painted boxes and daggers of fine work. We know that among his greatest treasures was carefully laid a single lock of a woman's hair, kept and honoured, that may have belonged to his grandmother, so that even a king carried with him into eternity a small keepsake of family love. And we know most tenderly of all that upon the innermost golden coffin, over the breast of the boy who lay within, someone had laid a small wreath of real flowers, cornflowers and other blossoms of the Egyptian spring, gathered fresh at the time of the burial. A last simple gift of colour and sweetness, laid upon the gold by a hand we cannot see, perhaps the hand of his young widow, saying farewell. Those little flowers, dried and brown but still holding their shape after 3,000 long years, are in their way as moving as all the gold in the tomb, for they are grief itself, preserved, the oldest bouquet in the world, laid down in love and never taken up again. Among all the things the mourners packed into that little tomb, the most precious to us now, after the gold, may be the words. For they wrote words everywhere, upon the shrines and the coffins, upon the walls and the amulets, and they laid written spells beside the body. And all of those words are about one thing only, the safe passage of a soul out of the dark and into the light. If we listen to them softly tonight, we will hear that the ancient Egyptians, thousands of years ago, were saying to their dead almost exactly what a gentle voice says to a child at bedtime, that the dark is safe, that the journey is known, that morning will come, and that they need not be afraid. They wrote, first of all, the truly great offering prayer that every Egyptian hoped to have spoken over him, and it is a prayer of quiet abundance. An offering which the king gives to the Lord of eternity, it says, that he may grant a going forth by day, and a breathing of the sweet north wind, and the drinking of water at the river's edge, and bread that does not fail, and peace in the beautiful west, for the spirit of the one who rests here. That was the whole hope laid out plainly, a going forth into daylight, a cool wind, clean water, bread that never runs short, and rest in a beautiful place. It is not a fierce hope or a grasping one. It is the hope of a tired traveller for a good inn at the far end of the road. They wrote out, too, the words the traveller would need in the hall of judgment, when the heart was weighed against the feather of truth, and these words are a long gentle list of all the wrongs the dead one swears he has not done, spoken calmly, one after another like counting. I have not done wrong, the dead one says. I have not robbed, I have not stolen, I have not killed, nor commanded any to kill. I have not made anyone weep, I have not taken the bread of the child, I have not turned away water in its time, I have not driven the cattle from their pasture. On and on it runs, a quiet inventory of an ordinary decent life, and toward the end of it the heart is found to balance the feather, and the traveller is declared true of voice, and welcomed through. There is no fire in it, no terror. There is only the deep Egyptian faith that a gentle and honest life is enough, that the scales are fair, and that most hearts, weighed kindly, are light enough to pass. Upon the golden mask itself, along its back and shoulders, they wrote a spell to protect the very face of the king, and it names his features one by one and gives each to the care of a god, as you might tuck a blanket around each shoulder of a sleeping child. It speaks to the head and the brow, to the eyes, to the limbs, and it tells the young monarch that his face is now the face of the sun, that his eyes are the two boats that carry the sun across the day and the night, that no harm can come to any part of him, because each part is now divine and guarded. To wear such words against one's skin into the dark, words that say you are watched over, you are made of light, no part of you will be lost, is to go into eternity wrapped in reassurance as much as in gold. And on the walls of tombs from that age, though not in the boy king's own small chamber, the Egyptians sometimes wrote or sang a gentler and more wistful kind of song, a song for the living to sing at a feast in memory of the dead, and one of these has come down to us whole. And it is perhaps the most beautiful thing they ever wrote about death, and the closest of everything to the spirit of an evening like this one. A harper sang it, and it said softly, "Those who built in granite, who raised great halls, and who did fine work, they became weary. Their altars are as empty as the altars of the tired ones who lie in the desert, whose walls have fallen. Yet none comes back from that country to tell us how they fare, to set our hearts at rest, until we ourselves go to the place where they have gone. So let your heart be at peace. Follow your heart while you live. Put sweet oil upon your head, clothe yourself in fine linen, and let not your heart grow tired. Remember, no one takes his goods with him, and no one who has gone there has ever returned. It is a song, in the end, about laying down the day's burdens, about letting the heart be still, about accepting the long rest with a kind of calm and even a kind of sweetness, and it might have been written for the very hour in which you are lying now, listening in the dark. For that, in the end, is what the whole of the young king's tomb is saying, under all its gold. The Egyptians did not build against death out of terror. They built against it out of love, and out of hope, and out of a deep, patient trust that sleep is not an ending but a passage. That the sun that sets in fire each evening in the west is the same sun that will climb again, unhurried and faithful, out of the east at dawn, and that a person laid down gently, wrapped warm, watched over, and told that the dark is safe, will wake in due time into a morning that is kinder than the day before. They laid their young Pharaoh down with that faith wrapped around him in linen and in gold and in words, and then they closed the door, and they let him sleep, trusting that all was well. And for 33 centuries, in the quiet of the valley, it was. Before we let the valley fall entirely silent, we should say a gentle word about those the young Pharaoh left behind, for a story is not only its hero, but also the people who go on living after him, and their tale, too, is smoothed here into calm. When the young Pharaoh died with no living child to follow him, the throne of Egypt stood suddenly empty, and this was a grave and difficult thing for a kingdom that placed such weight upon the unbroken line of its kings. His young widow was left alone at the head of the court, and we hear of her only a little more, a faint and poignant trace in the records, before she too slips quietly out of history and is seen no more, and we cannot know where or how her own long sleep began. We will not invent an ending for her. We will only wish her, across the centuries, the same peace her husband was given. The throne itself passed first, it seems, to the old adviser who had guided the boy through his childhood, an elderly man now, who ruled for only a few short years before he too went to his rest. And after him it passed to the soldier, the steady commander who had kept the borders safe through all the uncertain years, and he ruled longer and firmly, and set the kingdom back upon a strong footing. But these men who came after had little love for the memory of the strange Sun City and the troubled years that had produced the child king, and so, quietly and deliberately, they let his name fall away. They left him off the great lists of kings. They took, here and there, the credit for works he had begun. They did not hate him, so far as we can tell. They simply allowed him to be forgotten, folded him away like a page no one needed, and turned the country's face toward the future. And that forgetting, which must have seemed at the time like the final erasing of a small and unlucky reign, was in truth the very thing that saved him, for a king remembered is a king whose tomb is remembered too, and remembered tombs are robbed. Because they let him be forgotten, the robbers forgot him. Because the robbers forgot him, the sand kept him. Because the sand kept him, the whole world would one day know him. The unkindness of his own age became, across the long reach of time, the greatest kindness of all. And so we come back to the valley, and to the long silence, and let it settle over everything once more. Think, for a moment, of everything that happened in the world above that sleeping boy while he lay there in his gold. Empires that he could never have imagined rose to their full height and then crumbled back into the dust. Languages were born and flourished and died. The very gods he had helped restore were in time forgotten, their temples emptied, their names unreadable, and then, after long ages, remembered again. Great cities were built and burned and built once more. Countless millions of people were born and lived their single precious lives, and laughed and wept and worked and loved, and were laid to rest in their turn. Generation after generation after generation, more people than anyone could ever count. The whole vast river of human life flowing on and on above him. And through all of it, through every rise and every fall, through every dawn and every dusk of 30 centuries and more, the boy lay still and safe and golden in the dark, his calm face turned upward, waiting, without knowing that he waited, at the quiet, unmoving centre of the turning world. When at last he was found, and lifted into the daylight once more, the discovery did something to the whole world that is worth understanding, for it changed, quietly and forever, how ordinary people everywhere imagined the ancient past. Before the boy Pharaoh woke, Egypt had been, for most people, a matter of enormous ruins, of pyramids and broken statues and dusty mummies behind glass, grand but remote, the leavings of a stern and gloomy people obsessed with death. But the little tomb told a warmer story. Here was not gloom, but tenderness, not grim obsession, but hope and love and beauty. A young husband buried with his games and his flowers, and his grandmother's lock of hair, a family's grief made visible. A boy sent into the dark surrounded by everything soft and lovely his people could gather. The gold was dazzling, Yes, but it was the human sweetness underneath the gold that truly caught the world's heart, and from that day the ancient Egyptians ceased to be, in the popular mind, a people of the tomb, and became instead a people of life, who had loved the world so much that they could not bear to leave it, and who had built their whole faith around the hope of having it back again. The golden mask became, and remains, the single most recognizable object to survive from the entire ancient world, more famous than any statue, any temple, any crown. Its calm gold face gazes out from the covers of books and the walls of classrooms and the memories of everyone who has ever stood before it, and it has come to stand not just for one small king, but for all of ancient Egypt, for its artistry, its faith, its strange and lovely certainty that the light always returns. In our own time the treasures have been gathered into a vast new home built for them near the pyramids, a great museum where the whole golden world of the tomb can at last be shown together, every object that the mourners packed away in their sorrow set out once more in the light, so that the wholeness of what was given to the young ruler can be seen and felt as a single overwhelming act of love. People will go on filing quietly past that gold for as long as there are people, and each one of them, without perhaps quite knowing why, will feel that same deep calm settle over them in the presence of the child Pharaoh's peaceful face. And here we come to the gentlest truth at the bottom of the whole long story, the reason, perhaps, that it soothes us so. The ancient Egyptians looked at the sun, and they saw in it the pattern of all things. Each evening the sun grew red and heavy and sank down into the west, into the realm of the dead, and the world went dark, and to them that setting was a kind of death. The great golden god going down into the night country to make his long passage through the dark. But they were not afraid, because they had watched every single morning of their lives the same sun climb up again out of the east, new and bright and unwearied, reborn out of the darkness as though the night had only been a kind of sleep, and so they built their whole vision of death upon the thing they trusted most, the daily promise of the dawn. A hymn to the rising sun from those old days says it as simply as anything could: you rise in beauty, you cross the sky in peace, and every face is turned toward you. You go to rest in the western land, and the earth grows dark as though in death, and then you wake and rise, and the two lands are in festival, for the light has come again. That was their faith, laid over their dead like a warm coverlet. Night is only a crossing, the dark is only a passage. The light always, always comes back. The young monarch lived that faith and died into it, and slept the longest sleep in all of human memory wrapped inside it. And then, after 3,000 years of night, he did the very thing his people had always believed he would do. He came forth into the day. Not as they had pictured it, not through the gates of a painted underworld, but in his own strange and beautiful way, out of the sand, into the lamplight, into the wonder of a whole watching world, his golden face catching the light once more exactly as it had on the day they closed the door. In a sense we cannot quite explain and need not try to. The boy king's people were right. Morning did come for him. The light did return. And it returned not only for him, but in a quiet way, for everyone who has ever stood before his face and felt the fear go out of them. For he has become, of all the millions who have died and slept and been forgotten, the one who most perfectly shows us that sleep can be gentle, that the dark can be kind, and that what is set down in love is not lost. Let us go back now in these last quiet chapters and simply be in the world of the young king once more, without hurry, letting the images gather softly as they do at the margin of sleep. Picture the valley itself, the lonely desert hollow where he lay for so long, as it looks when the day ends there. All through the burning afternoon, the pale cliffs stand blinding white under a sky of deep and cloudless blue, and the heat lies heavy over the stone, and nothing moves but a hawk turning slowly high overhead. Then the sun begins to lower, and the light turns from white to honey to deep gold, and the cliffs blush warm and rose and amber, and the long shadows come stealing out across the valley floor. The air cools, the hawk settles, and as the last of the light slips over the western rim, the whole valley fills with a soft blue dusk, and the first stars come out, hard and bright in the desert sky. More stars than you have ever seen, spilled thick across the darkness from one cliff edge to the other. It is very quiet there at night, quiet as the inside of the earth, and it was into that quiet, under those same wheeling stars, that the young Pharaoh was given. And it was there, beneath that same patient sky, that he kept his long appointment with time. And picture, too, the river that made him, the great green Nile that was the beginning of this whole story and is its truest hero, flowing still, tonight, exactly as it flowed for him. It rises far away in the south and comes north through the desert, and along its banks the narrow green fields still lie, and the palm trees still stand in their rows, and the herons still stalk the shallows on their long careful legs, and the small boats still lean into the north wind with their sails spread wide, just as they did when a child king watched them from a palace window 3 centuries ago. The world above the ground has changed beyond all telling. New cities have risen, and new ways of living, and the great flood has been tamed at last by the works of modern hands. But the river itself goes on, patient and brown and life-giving, and if you stood on its bank tonight in the cool of the evening and watched the light go down over the water, you would be seeing very nearly the same thing the boy Pharaoh saw, the same slow gleam, the same soft dark coming on, the same first star trembling in the pale green sky above the palms. Some things are older than kings, and outlast them, and the river is one of them, and picture the makers, the patient hands that built the beauty we still marvel at, for they are as much a part of the comfort of this story as the king himself. Somewhere in the workshops of Thebes, in the ordinary daylight of an ordinary year, a goldsmith sat cross-legged on the floor with the pieces of the great mask before him, and worked, hour after hour, day after day, hammering the soft gold thin, coaxing it into the curve of a cheek, the line of a brow, the calm sweep of an eye. He would have known whose face it was. He would have known that a young man had died too soon, and that this shining likeness was meant to carry him beautiful and unafraid into the dark. And so he would have worked with more than skill, with tenderness, setting each band of blue glass into the striped headcloth, polishing the gold until it glowed, checking the calm half-smile again and again until it was exactly, perfectly at peace. He did not sign his name. He did not know that his work would outlast his whole civilization and become the most famous face in all the world. He only did the work in front of him as beautifully as he could, out of love and duty and pride in his craft, and then he handed it on, and it went into the darkness, and it waited, and here it is, still glowing, still perfectly at peace, thousands of years after the hands that made it turn to dust. There is a deep comfort in that, if you let yourself feel it, in the thought of all the patient, loving, unremembered work that quietly outlasts everything, and shines on long after the worker has gone to rest. For that is the last gift this old story has to give, as the lamplight burns low and the night settles in around you. It tells us, in its gentle way, that gentleness endures. Not the conquerors endured, in the end, nor the great boasting monuments of power, but the small tender things, the flowers laid on a coffin, the lock of a grandmother's hair, the calm face lovingly made, the quiet faith that the light would come again. Those were the things that survived, whole and unbroken, out of the wreck of 30 centuries. The armies and the empires blew away like chaff on the threshing floor. The tenderness remained. And perhaps that is worth carrying with you down into sleep tonight. The simple thought that the gentlest things are also, in the end, the most lasting, and that a life laid to rest in love and care, however short, however overlooked, however soon forgotten by the loud and busy world, is never truly lost, but only sleeping, and kept, and waiting, like a golden face beneath the sand, for its own quiet morning. Let us take one last gentle walk, in our imaginations, through the little tomb as the diggers first found it, room by quiet room, for there is a deep and soothing pleasure simply in picturing all those beautiful things resting where loving hands had placed them. Come down the 16 steps cut into the rock, and along the sloping passage, and through the first doorway into the outer room, the room the diggers named the antechamber. It is not large, and it is crowded almost past belief, filled from floor to ceiling with the furniture of a royal life. Against one wall stand the 3 great funeral couches, tall as a person, gilded and gleaming, each carved into the shape of a strange and gentle beast, a long-bodied cow with soft eyes, a fierce protective lioness, a curious creature part crocodile and part hippopotamus, all of them there to help lift the king toward the sky. Beneath the couches and heaped around them lie caskets and chairs and stools, dismantled chariots leaning in a golden tangle, alabaster jars carved as fine as lace, and dozens of plain white boxes and chests, each carefully packed, some with clothing, some with food, some with treasures, waiting in the dark. Look, against the far wall, at the little chair they found, a child's chair of ebony and ivory and gold, small enough for a very young boy, kept and treasured, it seems, from the king's own early childhood, and carried with him into eternity, as though even a pharaoh could not quite bear to part with the first small seat he ever knew. And look at the throne, the great gilded throne, its back inlaid with a scene of quiet tenderness, the young ruler seated at his ease while his girl queen leans toward him and touches his shoulder, the rays of the sun coming down gently upon them both, a picture of ordinary marital sweetness rendered in gold and silver and coloured stone, and left here in the darkness for no living eye, only for the gods and for the king himself to remember love by. Now stoop through the low broken doorway that the ancient robbers made into the small side room the diggers called the annex, and here everything is in a jumble, tumbled and heaped, for this was a storeroom, packed to the roof with the ordinary abundance of a life. Here are the jars of wine, each one marked with its year and its vineyard and the name of the vintner, so that we know the very vintages the child Pharaoh's household laid down for his eternity. Here are baskets of fruit, and loaves of bread, and jars of honey and oil, and heaps of the board games, and stools and baskets and shields and bows, the plain plenty of a great house, provided so the king should want for nothing at all in the long life to come. Then turn, and come at last to the doorway that the two golden guardian statues watched over for so long, and pass between them into the burial chamber itself. The heart of the tomb, the holiest room, and here the walls themselves are painted. The only painted walls in all the little tomb. On a golden background, figures move in solemn procession. Here the new king performs the opening of the mouth upon the still figure of his forebear. Here the young monarch is welcomed by the gods, embraced by the goddess of the west, greeted as one of the blessed dead. And words run beside the figures, words of welcome and of protection. And one wish among them says simply what every Egyptian longed to hear spoken over his rest. May you live again. May you endure for millions of years your face to the north wind, your eyes beholding happiness in the presence of the gods, forever and forever. Millions of years, and a cool wind on the face, and happiness before the eyes, forever. That was the blessing they painted on the wall beside their sleeping boy, and left burning quietly there in the dark across 30 centuries, a good night wish written in gold. And beyond the burial chamber, through one last low opening, lies the deepest and most secret room of all, the little room the diggers called the treasury, and here they found, standing guard, the most beautiful thing in the whole tomb after the mask itself. It was a great gilded shrine, and around it, facing outward, stood 4 slender golden goddesses, each at one wall. Their arms stretched wide, protecting what lay within, which was the shrine that held the preserved organs of the king. The 4 goddesses are lovely beyond describing, tall and graceful and gentle, their faces turned slightly aside, their golden arms opened in an endless gesture of shelter, as though they had been standing there, guarding, embracing, keeping watch over the sleeping king through every hour of every year of the whole long silence. And well they might, for that is what the Egyptians believed, that the dead were never truly alone, that they were watched over always by gentle unseen guardians with outstretched arms, and here that faith was made real in gold, 4 kind goddesses who never once let down their arms or turned away, through 30 centuries of dark, so that whenever the light finally came, whenever the door was finally opened, the boy king would be found exactly as he had always been, guarded, sheltered, and not alone. Of all the marvels lifted out of that little tomb, it is often the smallest and most ordinary things that move people most, and it is worth lingering over a few of them, because they carry us closer to the living boy than any quantity of gold could ever do. There was a trumpet among his treasures, a slender trumpet of bright metal, and thousands of years after it was laid away, it was carefully lifted out. and cleaned. And then, very gently, someone set their lips to it and blew. And across all those silent centuries, the instrument sounded again, a single clear ringing note filling the room, the very same voice it had had when the boy king was alive. Imagine that, a sound made in a world so long vanished, waking once more into the air of our own time, as though the young ruler had reached across the dark and touched us on the shoulder. There were fans among his things, tall ceremonial fans whose golden handles had once held rows of real ostrich feathers, and one of them bore a little inscription telling how the king himself had gone out hunting the birds whose plumes now stirred the air above him, so that even a fan carried the memory of an afternoon in the desert sun, a young man and swift horses, and the wide bright sky. There was a folding stool of ebony inlaid to look like an animal's dappled hide, the kind of camp stool a person might carry out to sit upon by the water. There were his writing things, and his walking sticks worn smooth by a real hand, and gloves, and belts, and games with their little playing pieces still waiting to be moved. There were even, most touchingly, ordinary loaves and trussed birds and cuts of meat, sealed in plain wooden boxes, the packed provisions of a journey, laid in by people who loved him and did not want him ever to go hungry in the country beyond. To stand among such things, or even to picture them, is to feel the great distance of the years suddenly fold up and disappear. For these are not the props of a myth, but the belongings of a person, chosen and touched and used and set down with care. Here was someone who liked fine things and swift chariots and the sound of music, who kept a chair from his own babyhood, who was married very young to a girl he seems to have been fond of, who lost 2 tiny daughters before they ever drew breath, who may have limped a little and leaned upon a stick, and who died before he had really begun to live, and was mourned deeply by those around him, and sent into the dark, wrapped in every comfort and every hope his people could gather. The gold is what draws the eye, but it is the humanity beneath the gold, the loaves and the fans and the little worn sticks and the withered flowers, that stays with us, and that turns a golden legend gently back into a boy. And perhaps that is why the whole world took him so completely to its heart, and takes him still. We do not marvel at him only because he was rich, for many kings were rich. We are moved by him because, through the accident of his long hiding, he alone came back to us whole, with all his ordinary belongings about him, and so he alone, of all the vanished millions of the ancient world, feels almost like someone we could have known, a real young person who once watched the same sun cross the same sky, who felt the same wind off the same river, who lay down at night in a quiet room and let the day go and drifted off to sleep, exactly as you are preparing to do now. The centuries that seem to divide us from him are, in the end, very thin. Under the gold and the strangeness he was simply young, and mortal, and loved, and tired at the end of his short day, and ready, when it came, for rest. There is a whole hidden country that the Egyptians believed lay on the far side of sleep, and since the young king carried its map with him into the dark, we may follow it a little way ourselves, softly, for it is the gentlest geography ever imagined. They believed that each night, when the sun sank red into the west, it did not simply vanish, but entered a long dark valley beneath the world, a night country of 12 hours through which the sun sailed slowly in its boat until it rose again, renewed, at dawn. And they believed that the blessed dead sailed with it, safe aboard that same boat, carried gently through the darkness toward the morning. It was not a fearful place, in the end, for those who came prepared. It had gates, and each gate had a name, and a soul who knew the name passed through in peace. It had guardians, and a soul who spoke to them kindly was let by. And all along the road there were words of comfort, written to be spoken, and the young Pharaoh carried them with him, painted and inscribed, so that he should never be lost and never be afraid. The books they laid beside their dead are full of such words, and they are strangely soothing to hear, even now, even for us who do not share the old beliefs, because they are so gentle and so sure. I go forth into the day, one of the old spells says, I pass through the gate. I am not turned back. The doors of the horizon are open to me, and the light receives me. I have come that I may see my Father, and walk again in the fields, and sit beneath the sycamore, and drink of the cool water, and be at peace forever among those who are at peace. Another speaks to the traveller as a mother speaks to a child at the door of sleep. Fear not, it says, you shall not perish. You shall live. Your name shall endure. You shall come forth by day, and your soul shall not be shut away. And you shall have power over the water and the sweet breath of the north wind. And you shall rest each night, and wake each morning, forever and ever. To lie in the dark with such words wrapped around you, promising that you will not be lost, that the light will receive you. That morning will come, and you will wake and walk in green fields, and drink cool water and be at peace, is to be given the very thing the whole channel of a night like this one is made to give, a hand in the dark, and the quiet promise that all is well. They imagined the fields at the journey's end as a place very like the Egypt they loved, only made perfect, and they called it, among other names, the Field of Reeds, and they painted it upon their walls, a green and shining country where the barley grew taller than a man, and the flood never failed, and the sky was always kind. There the blessed dead lived on in ease, ploughing gentle fields, harvesting endless grain, sailing calm blue waters, sitting with those they had loved beneath the shade of sweet trees, wanting for nothing, hurried by nothing, afraid of nothing, forever. It was, when you think on it, simply a dream of peace, the peace of an ordinary good day that never has to end. And it was toward that peace that the child king was sent, with a map in his hands and comfort in his ears, and a golden face turned toward the dawn. So let us think of him there now, if it pleases us, not shut in the dark at all, but walking easy in a green and endless morning. The fear all gone, the journey done, the light come back, exactly as his people so lovingly and so patiently prepared for him to do. There is one more part of the boy Pharaoh's living world that we should visit before we let the night close in, and it is the loveliest of all, the great festivals of the river year. For the Egyptians loved a festival, and their calendar was full of them, and the young ruler, in his short reign, would have stood at the very heart of the grandest of them. Imagine the greatest of the festivals of Thebes, held each year when the flood was rising, a festival of joy that lasted many days. The statue of the great hidden god was lifted from the dark of his innermost shrine, dressed and adorned, and set within a magnificent golden boat, and carried out upon the strong shoulders of the priests through the vast columned halls and out into the blinding day. While the whole city roared its welcome, the god was borne down to the river and placed aboard a real ship, gilded from stem to stern, and towed in a grand procession up the water to another great temple, and all along the banks the people came out in their thousands, singing, clapping, dancing, holding up their children to see, while musicians played and dancers turned, and the smoke of incense drifted in blue coils over the crowd, and the smell of 1,000 bouquets of flowers filled the air. For a few bright days the whole city gave itself over to gladness, and the child Pharaoh, in his finest linen and his golden collar, walked at the heart of it as the living link between his cheering people and their smiling God. And there was another festival, gentler and more tender, that speaks even more sweetly to a night like this one, a festival of the dead that was somehow not sad at all. Once each year the people of Thebes crossed the river to the west bank, to the kingdom of the tombs, not in grief but almost in joy, to visit their own beloved dead. Whole families went over together, carrying baskets of food and jars of wine and armfuls of flowers, and they gathered at the tomb chapels of their parents and grandparents, and they cleaned and tended the little shrines, and then they sat down, right there among the dead, and shared a meal, eating and drinking and talking softly as though the dead were simply quiet guests at the table, which, to the Egyptians, they were. And as the evening came on, they lit small lamps, little flames flickering all across the hillside of the dead, so that the whole west bank glimmered in the dusk like a field of fallen stars, each light a family keeping company with someone they had loved and let go. It was their way of saying that death did not break the bonds of love, that those who had crossed over were still near, still cherished, still visited, still, in the truest sense, part of the family. And it is a beautiful thing to think that the young monarch, before he became one of the sleeping dead himself, would have known that festival as a living child, would perhaps have crossed the river with his own household on such an evening, and watched the little lamps come out one by one across the darkening hills, never dreaming that he himself would one day lie beneath that very shore, waiting in his own small pool of eventual light. Hold that picture for a moment, the hillside of gentle lamps in the blue dusk, families gathered without fear among their dead, sharing bread and flowers and quiet talk, while the river darkens below and the first stars come out above. There is no better image in all of Egypt of what this whole long story has been trying to say. Death was not a horror to these people, and the dark was not an enemy. They were things to be met with love and lamplight, and the company of those who care for us, things to be prepared for gently and entered peacefully, in the sure and settled trust that the light comes back, that the ones we lay down are only resting, and that love reaches even into the deepest quiet and keeps its watch there, patient as a golden goddess with her arms spread wide, patient as the stars, patient as the river that flows on through every night toward a morning it has never once failed to reach. And now, as our long journey draws toward its rest, let us return to where we began, to a small boy in a great painted room by the edge of the desert, and let us imagine one ordinary evening of his living days, an evening much like the one you are settling into now. The heat of the day has broken. Out beyond the palace walls the river lies smooth and darkening, and the last boats are drawing into shore, and the sounds of the city are growing soft and few. A dog somewhere, a snatch of song, the low voices of servants closing up the great house for the night. In the boy king's chamber the fan-bearers stir the warm air gently with their long feathered fans, and the day's linen is folded away, and a single oil lamp is lit and set upon its stand. And its small steady flame throws a warm and living light across the painted walls, and there they are, the painted gods and birds and rivers, glowing softly in the lamplight, seeming almost to move as the flame wavers, the calm-faced gods with their gentle hands, the long-legged birds among the reeds, the blue water and the green fields and the golden sun, the whole ordered, loving. Beautiful world of Egypt laid out upon the wall of a child's room to watch over his sleep. The boy lies back upon his bed with its headrest of smooth wood, and the covers are drawn up, and the fan moves slowly, and the lamp burns steady, and outside the window the desert cools, and the great stars come wheeling up over the valley of the kings across the river, and the boy watches the lamplight climb the painted wall as children do, following the slow gold light as it touches one gentle figure and then another, and his eyes grow heavy, and the day lets go of him, and he drifts, warm and safe and watched over, down into an ordinary night's sleep, with no idea at all that he is a king the whole world will one day mourn and marvel at. No idea of the gold and the dark and the long, long waiting to come. He is only a sleepy child in a warm room, watching the light on the wall, letting the night take him gently. And that, of everything in his story, may be the truest picture of all, and the kindest, and the best to carry with you now into your own rest, for his whole long tale, in the end, comes down to that quiet gift, the gift of a safe and gentle sleep. His people gave it to him in life, a warm room and a steady lamp, and a wall of watching gods. They granted it to him again in death, wrapping him in gold and love and good words, and laying him down to rest with his grandmother's hair and a bunch of spring flowers and 4 kind goddesses to keep their arms about him through the dark. And time itself, in its strange and patient way, offered it to him a 3rd time, hiding him deep and keeping him whole, and letting him sleep in peace for 30 centuries beneath the desert stars, until at last the morning came, and the light returned, and his calm gold face woke into the wonder of the world. He was given the thing we all most need and most long for, at the close of every day, and at the close of the one long day that is a life. The simple mercy of being allowed to lie down, warm and watched over and unafraid, and to sleep. The story of Tutankhamun, the golden young king of Egypt, has now come to its close. It began beside a slow brown river with the yearly gift of black earth, and it wound through a strange bright reign of sun worship, and the crowning of a child, and the mending of the old gods, and a short golden life along the water, and a quiet passing into the long sleep, and 30 centuries of sand and silence, and a lamplit doorway by the end of a hopeless season, and a whisper of wonderful things, and a face of gold waking into a new age's wonder. It is a story of how the least remembered became the best remembered, of how the gentlest things outlast the grandest, and of how the dark, met with love, is only ever a passage toward the light. Even the greatest kingdoms rise and fall within the larger rhythms of the river and the sun and the turning stars, and yet nothing that was truly loved is ever wholly lost, but only kept a while, and waited for, and welcomed home again at last. So let the story settle now into stillness, and let it carry you the rest of the journey. Take a slow breath, and let it out slowly, and feel the soft weight of the covers over you, and let the gentle hum of the fan blend into the quiet darkness of your room. There is nothing more tonight that you need to do, and nowhere you need to be, and nothing you need to carry. The lamp is burning low. The gods are watching from the wall. The river is flowing on beneath the stars, as it always has and always will, and somewhere in the warm dark a golden face is resting, perfectly at peace. Let your eyes grow heavy. Let the day let go of you. Sleep well, and rest deeply, and let the gentle current of the past carry you softly down into peaceful dreams, on and on until morning, when the light, as it always does, comes quietly back again.